listener production.
Hey, Chris here with you. Welcome to The Briefing. Should a child as young as 10 face the same jail time as an adult offender? It's the promise being delivered in one Australian state right now, with human rights organisations and even the UN slamming the laws as racist and incompatible with international rights.
We are not only ripping away their childhood, we're also ripping away all their hopes and dreams.
That deep dive looking into Australia's youth crime crisis and whether adult time for adult crime could work is coming up in the second half of this episode. First though, let's get into the headlines with Dan Mullins, who is real despite people thinking he's an AI voice. It's Tuesday, the 27th of May.
Hi Chris, and to you listening. Footage has emerged of French President Emmanuel Macron being shoved in the face by his wife Brigitte. The pair appear on the presidential jet as they arrived in Vietnam for an official tour, and you can see Macron facing his wife with a kind of stern look on his face, and then you see Brigitte's arm come into view, slap his face and shove him. Macron then turns to see the cameras at the bottom of the stairs and waves. The couple then emerge from the aircraft, and while Macron offers his arm to his wife to steady her, she grabs the handrail.
Yeah, the Macron administration initially tried to say the footage was fake, but later conceded it was real. The president later telling reporters in Hanoi, "We were bickering, or rather just fooling around with my wife," but to my surprise, it turned into some kind of geopolitical catastrophe. He went on to say, "People are saying all sort of nonsense. Everyone just needs to calm down." I don't know, Dan, I saw this footage and I was like, another very, very embarrassing moment for the president. I mean, it was just a few weeks ago that he was made to deny allegations that he had a bag of cocaine while posing for a photo with the UK Prime Minister and the German Chancellor on a train to Ukraine. So, I mean, yeah, not a good few weeks for Macron at all.
He jumped on it immediately, though. He has conceded, yeah, okay, the footage is real, but it was just bickering. Everyone needs to calm down. I think he's owned it. Rightly so. The Kremlin has responded to US President Donald Trump's criticism of Russian President Vladimir Putin. Here's what Trump had to say yesterday, responding to reports Russia had sent 367 drones into Ukraine, killing 13 people.
We're in the middle of talking and he's shooting rockets into Kiev and other cities. I don't like it at all. I don't like what Putin is doing, not even a little bit. He's killing people.
Taking to Truth Social, Trump said Putin had gone absolutely crazy and Russia's needless killing in Ukraine's capital would lead to the downfall of Russia. The Kremlin responding overnight with the spokesperson saying Trump's comments were connected to an emotional overload of everyone involved. So a mention there of peace talks that are ongoing that the US has been involved in. And as to those attacks, Ukraine said it was Russia's largest combined aerial attack, so rockets and drones, since Russia's invasion in February 2022. Russia says those attacks were a retaliation to strikes from Ukraine.
Trump and Putin had a 2-hour phone call last week to discuss a US proposed ceasefire, and Trump said he believed the call had gone very well. And he repeatedly said during last year's campaign that he'd end the war in the first 24 hours in office. Maybe the frustration's starting to show.
Back home now, where millions of Australians are under severe weather warnings this morning as a strong cold front brings damaging winds and dangerous coastal conditions to at least 3 states along the east coast. Heavy wind and rain has already hit parts of South Australia, with hundreds of residents calling emergency services for assistance yesterday and overnight.
The system's expected to continue moving east into Victoria today, affecting Greater Melbourne, before heading over parts of New South Wales in the coming days. Affected residents are being told to expect winds anywhere from 65 to 125 kilometres per hour.
Yeah, and while we're talking about wild weather, obviously the cleanup efforts are continuing in flood-affected New South Wales today. Something interesting that came out of there last night, police are warning against looting with extra officers on the ground in the mid-north coast and the Hunter region, and that comes after 2 men were arrested for allegedly looting in Taree.
If you've always argued you save heaps of money working from home, you're right. You're saving over $5,000. New research from Deloitte Access Economics shows the average Australian worker could save $5,308 a year by taking out transportation and fuel costs.
Oh, that is music to my ears this morning, Dan. The study also found the standoff between employers expecting staff to work from the office and employees wanting to work at least some days from home had ended. 80% of those surveyed expected work from home would continue for at least the next 2 years. Now, Dan, you and I, we don't really get that luxury much working from home. We do have to be here 5 days a week. But I will say, in previous jobs, working from home is the greatest work perk. And I'm excited to see that this is something that's looking like it's going to continue.
Yeah, $5,000 goes a long way considering we're in a cost of living crisis, for sure, yeah.
And the verdict is in. You, our listeners, are not delulu for Labubu. On the back end of Friday's Deep Dive, looking into the plush toy that's got a hold on the world's millennials, Gen Zers and alphas at the moment, we asked you on Instagram whether you're on the Labubu train, with just 5% of you saying you were.
26% of you said you weren't. 56% of you went that step further, saying you will never get on the train, while 13% of you said, maybe one day.
Dan, now that begs the question. I've got you opposite me now. Are you on the Labubu train?
I have to concede. Full disclosure, I may have Googled it yesterday in the office while you were talking about it.
Uh-huh.
No, I'm not on the train. I'll never be on the train. And I'm happy for the train to just keep on rushing by.
Oh, I love to hear it. And hey, you're not alone. You and our briefers see eye to eye. It's a beautiful thing.
I'm with the briefers.
Thanks so much, Dan. That brings our headlines to a close. Coming up next is my deep dive, looking into Australia's youth crime crisis and whether adult time for adult crime is a solution at all. What do you know about youth crime in Australia? And where does your knowledge come from?
2 teenagers have been charged over what police have described as a gang-related brawl involving machetes at a busy shopping centre.
A teenage boy has been charged with the murders of 2 people after a crash in an allegedly stolen 4-wheel drive.
Cars have been stolen, homes and businesses broken into, with detectives investigating if the children have ties to a wider criminal network.
If you ask our politicians, we have a national youth crime crisis. But if you ask the Australian Bureau of Statistics, it paints a very different picture, with the latest data showing a 3% decrease in youth offending across the country. And that's a trend that tracks across almost every state, including Queensland, which has just introduced additional adult crime, adult time laws that would see kids as young as 10 years old face harsher penalties for a range of offences, including rape, murder, arson, torture, and manslaughter. They're a key part of the state Premier David Crisafulli's election campaign before being voted in last year, and despite being slammed by the UN last week, he says he's living up to his election promise.
You don't control me and I don't answer to you. I answer to Queenslanders who've had their lives turned apart. We make laws to deal with one of the biggest issues this state has ever faced. And it's a generation of repeat, hardcore young offenders who were created by weaker laws. So I say to the United Nations, you focus on the things you control and I'll look after the things that I control.
Jerry Georgiadis is a social justice campaigner and researcher from the National Suicide Prevention and Trauma Recovery Project who has hands-on experience working with young offenders in Australia. Jerry, welcome to the briefing. How does it make you feel that a 10-year-old, so a kid in year 5 of primary school, can be locked up and treated like an adult criminal in Australia?
Well, we've got children sitting in jails. They're already sitting in police watch houses, which shouldn't be happening. And they're sitting in juvenile detention centres, which are children's prisoners. So we've conditioned them to stir crazy sales in jail. But to formalise that and to escalate it to adult prison, it frustrates me that now we're going to have a legislature to actually support and justify the incarceration of children as effectively adults and in settings that are for adults as opposed to children. We are not only ripping away their childhood, we're also ripping away all their hopes and dreams.
Jerry, can you paint a little bit of a picture for our audience? What does being locked up do to a child?
It sends them from the dark tumult of the sufferings of their lives, because most of these children that come before the youth justice system, whether in Queensland or in Western Australia, in the Northern Territory or in New South Wales, are children who have not had advantages in life from the beginning of life. They've had disadvantages and suffering from the beginning of life. They've been left behind. Their families are families of the most impoverished, from the lowest quintile of income based in this country. We should be doing everything possible to redeem the lives of these children, to turn their lives around, and putting them in juvenile detention and also compounding this adult time when they're children who are committing aberrance and not adult crime is beyond the diabolical. It is demonising and lampooning them and escalating them to a life of incarceration as adults from effectively children, which guarantees that they'll be adult prisoners when they're adults.
I do want to talk about the flip side of this coin, Jerry, for a moment. On the other side of this, we have the families of victims, so some who have suffered severe trauma from crimes like stabbings and robberies, and some of those families of victims, they're welcoming these tougher laws. So if it's not adult time for adult crime, what else can be done in the justice system to address the needs and the wants of victims and families of victims?
Well, I feel for the victims, but we wouldn't have as many of these victims as would be if we worked on the life transformative. We can't create a divide, a pitchfork standoff between the haves and the have-nots, which is what we're doing. And we're creating a circumstance that other countries aren't doing. We've got to look no further than Norway, for instance, where children who commit crime are actually supported because they're children, whether they're 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17 years of age, with psychiatrists, psychologists, educators, social workers, therapists, everything that one should do to support those who have never had a chance in the beginning of life to catch up with their learning, to contextualise, to go forward and believe in themselves. And if you believe in someone for long enough, they'll believe in themselves. And that's the key to all of this, dynamic partnerships. And we've got to do that here in Australia, because I'll give you the startling statistic. 90% of children who offend from age 10 and above anywhere in Australia will go on to offend a second time and a third time and a fourth time. 90% of children in Norway who offend once will not offend again.
So it sounds like we've got an issue when it comes to reoffending. Unfortunately, we're kind of in this spot where these crimes are happening and we're not getting to young offenders early enough. In your opinion, does prison have a place, even as a temporary measure, when it comes to young offenders in Australia?
Prisons need to be transformed. They have a place if they're transformed. If they're not transformed, they're guaranteeing more victims. We need to understand that we're a human family, that we've got to understand that many have stepped into unfairnesses or were born into unfairnesses in life that others were not. As Australians who live in households much more secure than those who live in insecure households and in vulnerability, find unimaginable what most of them go through, the suffering that they've endured. We've got to look at Holland, for instance, another example. They've closed 23 prisons in the last decade, 23 prisons, because they've transformed these prisons into places of specialist treatment for people with aberrant behaviour, disorders, psychoses, all sorts of trauma that they've gone through. They've transformed these prisons into educational facilities. They've transformed these prisons into places without bars. They've transformed these prisons into the opportunity for people to turn their lives around, and they do. The statistics speak. If it can be done there, it can be done here. But we don't have a moral and political will.
Jerry, what would you say to people who that message, and even looking overseas for inspiration, that just doesn't cut it for them, and they're looking for these kids to be, at the end of the day, you know, some of these crimes involve murder or manslaughter, like lives are being lost across the country at the hands of some youth and juvenile offenders. What's your message to someone who thinks these all-encompassing and very human-centred solutions just don't cut it and they still want that tough-on-crime approach?
Well, then they have before their eyes the situation or trauma of America, the United States of America, where 1% of the total population is incarcerated, where 1 in 4 of the world's prisoners are incarcerated. And the statistics go up and up. We can't become like that. If we want a safer society, we need to do what Norway does. They've had child murderers, but those children are surrounded with love and have their lives turned around. They don't murder again. That's as simple as I can say it. I know I sound idealistic, but I've spent my life, 43 years, I'm 63 years old, working with the vulnerable, the critically vulnerable, the ones who everybody gives up on, the ones who everybody turns away. I've never lost anyone to suicide. I've never lost anyone again to a prison. It's about turning their lives around. It's not rocket science. It's about supporting them. I take a mentor-mentee approach on a 24/7 basis. And we got the expertise in this country, seasoned expertise in this country, to do exactly what has been done in other countries where difference has been made.
Now, Jerry, for someone who's unfamiliar with your work and the type of work that you and your organisation undertake, what does that 24/7 support look like, and how does that differ to our current system and how we currently deal with juvenile offenders or young offenders in this country?
We don't have 24/7 support. The only 24/7 support that we can call is what is the carceral experience, 24/7 behind stone walls, barbed wire and bars. And when they're released, 70% will reoffend and 80% will go on to adult incarceration. So that's what we have to understand. What I do is we have a mentor-mentee approach where we have them leaning on us in the equivalent form of community and family setting, and many of them don't have families. There's a significant proportion that are orphans. There are a significant proportion whose parents are in jail. There's a significant proportion who are in the care of the state. We take calls after hours. We provide assisted living, stabilisation on a 24/7 hour basis. So we're there for them all hours as we would be for our children. So we give them the emotional regulation. We give them the psychosocial outreach. We spend our days under the sun together. We do things for them, even when they've exited from the programs and the supports that have held them together and nurtured them. And we provide that mentorship ongoing through the years, through their 20s and their 30s even.
Another element to this, Jerry, is the disproportionate impact on First Nations children. Amnesty described the laws in Queensland as openly racist and brazenly cruel in this respect. Can you unpack that criticism for us a little bit?
Well, in my view, they're correct. There's an intersection between poverty and racism. And when it comes to First Nations people, nearly half live in the lowest quintile or lowest fifth of income base. And they've got a crushing poverty that's not fundamental to the poverty of other Australians who live below the poverty line. We need to recognise that extreme unfairness that they were born into. And we need to focus in on the grim reality and invest in the monies that need to be invested in to turn their lives around. And we can't keep on saying sorry without damages.
Jerry, before we let you go, the Premier of Queensland got into a little bit of an argy-bargy, if that's what we're going to call it, with the UN. The UN has slammed these adult crime, adult time laws as an attack on children's rights. Premier Crisafulli has bitten back at that. What advice do you have for him and others around the country who are looking to toughen up our criminal laws in similar ways?
Crisafulli and Albanese and Susan Ley, they should all get on a plane, go to Norway, see how they do what they do there and see how beautiful it actually works. They don't have 1,000 kids in their juvenile detention facilities. They have 4. We have 800 to 1,000 a year, and half of the children are the first peoples of this country, and that's an abomination.
Jerry Georgiadis, thank you so much for joining us on The Briefing.
Thank you, Chris.
That was Jerry Georgiadis from the National Suicide Prevention and Trauma Recovery Project speaking with me there. That is it for this episode of The Briefing. Thank you so much for listening. If you found this episode interesting, don't forget to leave us a comment or a review, or you can check us out on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. We always love hearing from you. Don't forget, we've got an episode coming out this afternoon with Natasha Belling, and I'll be back in your feeds tomorrow morning for another dose of headlines and an interesting deep dive. But until then, I'm Chris Spiru. Catch you next time.
Listener.